In 2007, my wife Rebecca and I, we were sent to Taipei, Taiwan, and there I spent the next 4 years studying the language, the culture, and the religions of Asia. I led a team, a multinational team, across 7 cities, 5 different countries, and involved 8 different experts in the areas of migration, language, religion, and history. And the things that I found in that journey were absolutely amazing and, in my case, life-changing. In Beijing, there is a complex called the Temple of Heaven, or the Altar of Heaven, and it is the largest religious complex on earth. It was built in the early 1400s. And it was designed specifically for an annual sacrifice called the border sacrifices. And during the border sacrifices, the Emperor of China every single year would come to this complex, and he would go through an elaborate ceremony, offering different offerings and praying, and they'd be singing to their deity called Shangdi. Now, what's fascinating is that the original service of the border sacrifice dates back to 2400 BC. 2400 BC. So we're talking about 4,500 years ago. This sacrificial system has been documented to have taken place every single year up until the year 1911, when the Communist Party took over mainland China. So this is a ceremony that has got a tremendous amount of history embedded into the language, the culture, and the history of China and their peoples. In the center of the complex, there is a building, a structure called the Temple of Heaven. And what's fascinating in Chinese ancient religion is that, unlike all the other religions in the East, not a single idol or image of their deity was ever created. It's never been found to this day. All of the images and statues have all come in from places like India and with the impact of Buddhism. But in Chinese history and in archaeological findings, there's not a single graven image of this Shangdi. All there is, if you go to Beijing, even today, and you wait in line and you walk up and find the tower here, the central tower and the pillars, you walk inside and you'll find this blue, it's like a banner, and it's got 4 characters written on it, and that is the name of Shangdi, the great emperor above. That's all there is. There's no picture of what he looks like, there's just his name. It's absolutely fascinating. The complex takes up a number of square kilometers right in the heart of Beijing. And as I said, it was built in 1420s AD, but that was replacing the original one that was built much earlier when they moved the capital of China. So what was the purpose of this complex? Why did the Emperor of China conduct this ceremony every single year for nearly 4,500 years? What was the purpose? We turn to the ancient Chinese writings, which are written by what we call today in English the Chinese sages. Now, for most of us, we think of Chinese sages, the main one that comes to mind is Confucius. And for us in the West, we think of Confucius as, kind of light-hearted sort of guy. And he's sort of, isn't he the guy that wrote all the fortune cookies that you get at the Chinese restaurant? Confucius say, and fill in the blank, right? But in Chinese literature, Confucius is one of the greatest minds of that part of the world. It's absolutely fascinating, the things that he wrote. I want to share what he wrote regarding the sacrifices that were given in the Temple of Heaven complex there in the capital by the emperor. He wrote this: "He who understands the ceremonies of the sacrifices of heaven and earth," that's talking about the border sacrifices, "would find the government of a kingdom as easy as to look into the palm of his hand." He then says, "The ceremonies of heaven and earth are those by which man serve Shangdi." In Confucius's mind, this complex, it exists and has somehow, if you understand it, it holds the key to understanding everything, how everything works. You can run all the most complicated things of government as simply as just looking at the palm of your hand. It's fascinating that in Confucius's mind, this complex has the key to understanding everything. And at the center of it, its worship is the acknowledgement of man serving this great Shangdi, the emperor above, is the literal translation in English. Now, what we have is a great resource in the Chinese historical records, is that the prayers and the songs that were sung during this annual sacrifice that's been running, as I said, up until 1911, are well documented. It's not hidden. Any scholar, anybody who's got access to the internet today, that makes you all scholars, right? It's easy to find this stuff. It's all been documented. It's all available in all the libraries around the world that have the Chinese resources. And we know exactly what the emperor would say every single year. In fact, if you get on the plane and fly to Beijing and you get there right at the right time of the year, you can see them reenact it. They reenact the ceremony every year in Beijing. And this is what one of the prayers or songs that the emperor would say every single year. Notice this with me on the screen. It says, of old, this is the emperor speaking, of old, in the beginning, there was great chaos, without form and dark. The 5 planets had not begun to revolve, nor the sun and moon to shine. You, O spiritual sovereign, that's a reference to Shangdi, you first divided the grosser part from the purer part. You made heaven and you made man. All things with their reproducing power got their being. This is the emperor speaking to Shangdi yearly for 4,200 years, documented in history. It then goes on and says, when Shangdi, the Lord, this is the emperor still speaking, had so decreed, he called into existence heaven, earth, and man. Fascinating that for 4,200 years, this was an annual part of the ceremony, acknowledging that Shangdi was the giver of all things, the creator of all things, and they dedicated the borders. The reason it's called border is they would sacrifice to the border at one of the solstice and to the other border and the other solstice, and they would dedicate the country called Middle Kingdom, which we call China today, to Shangdi. It was his land. In fact, the very name in Chinese for China means God's land. It's unbelievable. Long before there was a Buddhist or a Confucius or a Taoist or any other thing. This idea that God is a creator, Shangdi is their creator, is encoded in their very language. Here's some examples. This is the Chinese character. This is traditional Chinese. For those of you who use simplified, it's a little bit different in simplified, but this is the original characters. The Chinese character for creation, here it is here. It's a pictographic language and it's used by building up smaller pictures to create a new picture. I'll give you an illustration. This first part at the top represents the picture or the word for dust or soil. The second part there is mouth or breath. And the last part there is motion. So when the Chinese originally sat down, and by the way, we have some of these characters dated back to 4,000 years. They've been etched into tortoise shells. So you can still go to museums and find them. They've been carbon dated and validated to being this old. In a Chinese mind, about 4,000 years ago, the idea of creation was soil and dust with a mouth and breath and movement following. This sounds exactly the same as what the Hebrew text says, which, by the way, this predates the Hebrew text by almost 1,000 years. It's unbelievable. Another one. The word for forbid in Chinese is made up of 2 trees and an instruction. We see a similar picture in the Hebrew text that show that there is 2 trees with an instruction given. And the instruction that was given was, I forbid you to eat this tree. The same picture of the stories of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is seen replete through Chinese characters. There are more than 250 characters that have the similar stories of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. I'm not going to go through all of them, trust me. Restrain. Here is a tree with a mouth. In our language today, in English, restrain would be a red circle with a line through it over something, right? No parking, red circle, line over it. No eating, red circle, line over it. In Chinese, the original idea of restraint or control yourself was take your mouth off the tree. Again, a similar story we find in the book of Genesis. The tempter. The tempter is made up of the character for devil, but he's under a cover of 2 trees. Where do we find this imagery in the book of Genesis? Right there in chapter 3. We have what the Bible calls a serpent showing up under the cover of 2 trees. And you might go, well, you're a white guy. What would you know about this? This doesn't come from me. This comes from the experts in the field who speak this language, write this language, and they understand this is exactly what the story is contained in these characters. If we take this character here, devil, and expand that one, it's a garden, a man, secretly. So in the ancient Chinese mind, there's someone secretly showing up in the garden, and that's the devil. And if you put him under the cover of 2 trees, that's the tempter. It's fascinating. All of the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis take us up to this event, the Tower of Babel. In Chinese, the characters that embed the same stories go right up to this event. And then they have a whole lot of characters about a migration, a great migration to the east, which is where the Chinese ended up. So when we talk about Confucius as one of the sages of China, he has a background understanding some of this historical information. He makes the point that this sacrificial system has something to do with man serving Shangdi. Shangdi. This is the second sage I want to refer to. The second sage in China is a guy called Meng Se. He was a disciple of Confucius's grandson. Now, Meng Se, in Chinese history and language and religion, he has perhaps created the biggest enigma for many Chinese scholars. And I want to share with you that enigma today. He was a student of history, Chinese history, and he seems to have made, and he does make, an observation based on that understanding. And this is what he says. Meng Se said, from Yao to Shan. Now, these are some of the first emperors in the Chinese story. From Yang to Shan down to Tang were 500 years or more. So he's making an observation. So if I put this on a timeline for you, he's simply saying that from these 2 guys, and this is their date here in time, there were 500 years until this guy showed up, another notable character in Chinese history. We don't have time to explain why and all that business. But he goes on in his statement, he says, now from Tang to King Wen were 500 years and more. So we look at the actual reality of that. And there were 524 years between this guy and this guy. Then he goes on and says, now from King Wen to Confucius were 500 years and more. We put that on the slide as well, and we find that it was 581 years from the death of King Wen down to the birth of Confucius. Now, so far it's been a history lesson. This was all previous history for Meng Se. But now he comes out with an observation. This is why I want to stress to you, if you don't learn anything from this series that we're doing today, is take note that you can learn things about the future from history. Notice his next statement. He says, if that was the case in the time then, that's the past, it should be the same now. The holy man should arise in the course of 500 years. So in Meng Se's position, he's a disciple of Confucius's grandson. He has observed the past. He's looking to the future. He says, listen, we should expect to see the holy man show up in 500 years from Confucius. If you add that to the timeline, Confucius, he died in 479 BC. If you add exactly 500 years, and I want to stress this because I'll make this point a lot, he's not saying it's exactly 500 years. Did you get that? He said it'll be in the order of 500 years. And the previous ones, he says it's 500 years or more. It's around the 500 year mark. That's his point. But for the sake of illustration, I'm going to take exactly 500 years. I don't actually think it is exactly, but I'm going to use it for an illustration. If we add exactly 500 years to Confucius' death in 479, we end up with the year 22 AD. In 22 AD, Meng Se is telling us we should expect to see the holy man. That's what he's telling us. Are in the order of 22 AD. It's not exact, but around 500 years. Does that make sense so far? Confucius now is asked about the holy man in the context here. Some people think that Confucius is the holy man of the ancient Chinese. No, he's not. He himself says he is not. Some ask Monk Sir if he is, and he says, no, I'm not. This is what Confucius said about the holy man. He said, if a holy man were to arise, it would still require 30 years for his love to be revealed. According to Confucius, the holy man is going to show up around 30 years of age. That's his point. So we put that together with Monk Sir. We're looking for a holy man to show up around 22 AD, but he'd be about 30 years old when he shows up. You following so far? So who is the holy man according to the Chinese? We're going to go through rapidly, because I'm running out of time here, through the ancient Chinese classics and the poets and see what they come up with. Monk Sir wrote this. He said, the holy man is a teacher of hundreds of generations. The holy man teaches with the word of God, and the entire universe surrenders to him. Thus, when heaven, or referring to Shangdi, is about to confer a great office on this man, this is the holy man, it says he first exercises his mind with suffering and sinews and bones and toil. He exposes his body to extreme hunger, and subjects himself to extreme poverty. A famous Chinese poet, Lao Tzu, he says this, why did the ancient masters esteem the holy man so much? Because being one with the holy man, when you seek him, you will find. When you commit a sin, you will be forgiven. That is why everybody loves the holy man. He knows his glory, yet he remains in disgrace. Therefore, said the holy man, he who is disgraced for the kingdom is the Lord of the kingdom. He who suffers for the kingdom is the king of the universe. The Chinese classics put it this way. Although with struggling and hesitation, his mission and actions came out just and right. Stepping down from a noble position, he assumed a lower position, thus winning the hearts of the people. There's not a single emperor in Chinese history who ever accomplished this. Not a single one. The holy man puts all others before him, and watch this. He laid down his what? His life, and his life exists through selfless action and attains fulfillment. Therefore, the holy man is good at saving all men, so that no one is forsaken. He takes care of all, and nothing is abandoned. Very quickly, there are 15 points I've just gone through. The holy man, from China's perspective, would show up around the age of 30. He would appear around 500 years after Confucius. He would expose his body to hunger. He would subject himself to extreme poverty, be a teacher of 1,000 generations. He forgives the sins of all men. He saves all men. He puts everyone else first. He laid down his own life, and yet he still lives. The entire universe surrenders to him. He is the king of the universe. He stepped down from a noble position. He assumed a lower position, and he wins the hearts of the people. Pretty specific. I told you about a Babylonian prophet this morning called Daniel. Daniel lived at the exact same time as Confucius. Confucius was in China. Babylon had Daniel, exact same time. I told you about Daniel chapter 2 this morning. Now I'm going to tell you about Daniel chapter 9. In chapter 9, Daniel receives a dream, and in that dream, he claims that he has been shown when Messiah, the holy man, will show up. I want to take you through this very quickly. This is what Daniel claims an angel told him. Again, take it or leave it, this is what he claims. He says, 70 weeks that he determined upon your people, that's the Jews, and for your holy city, that's Jerusalem, to seal up the vision, the prophecy of the Most High, and anoint the Most Holy. Understand that from the going forth and command to what? Restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah, that's the anointed one, the chosen one, that's the holy man, to the prince, there'll be 69 weeks. Then he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring the end to the sacrificial offering, or the sacrifices and offerings. Let's look at Daniel's prophecy very quickly. His prophecy begins when a command is given to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. We know from history that that took place in 476 BC by Artaxerxes, Medo-Persian king. If we count now, as we already heard, in the Bible prophecy, 1 day equals 1 year. If we have got 70 weeks, we have 70 times 7 days, that's 490 days. So if we count 490 years, we end up with the year 34 AD. That's the total extent of this prophecy that Daniel has been given. But specifically, if you caught it, I know I'm going fast, but if you caught it, he was more interested in knowing when this holy man, the Messiah, would show up. And what the angel told him, according to Daniel, is it would be 69 weeks when he showed up and got anointed. That's 483 years, if 1 day equals 1 year in Bible prophecy. And as we heard, there's good reason to think that. So at 27 AD, Daniel has been told to expect the holy man. 27 AD. We know from history, from inside the Bible and outside of the Bible, that the person of Jesus Christ showed up in 27 AD and was baptized. We know it because it specifically gives us the year in Scripture that we can correlate with the Roman history. It then says that there's 1 more week left, that's 7 years, and in the middle of that week, which would be 3.5 years in, 31 AD, he would cause sacrifices to end. Exactly what happened in the stories of the Gospels. Jesus did his thing for 3.5 years. In the middle of 3.5 years, he was put to death on a cross. And if you know your Bible stories, and I never used to know them until the age of 24, when I became a Christian, in the Bible story, when Jesus dies on that cross, which we just celebrated with Easter, right? The temple veil rips in two. And the sacrificial system ends. That's why Christians don't sacrifice, right? At least they shouldn't. So if you overlay this with the Chinese prediction, the Chinese, if we took it exactly at 500 years, and there's no evidence to suggest it should be exactly 500 years, but if we did, we'd be looking at 22 AD. The actual Messiah of Daniel's prophecy showed up at 27 AD. That's only 5 years difference if it was exactly 500 years. But remember, Confucius said he'd be about 30 years old when he showed up. Guess what the Bible tells us in the gospel account? It says when Jesus shows up and gets baptized, he is 30 years old. Unbelievable. I'd like to suggest, and many scholars agree with me, that the holy man of China is the Messiah that the Jews were looking for. You ever wonder about why there's wise men from where? The East showing up. They were looking for someone at the same time on Earth's stage. I'll go through this very quickly. I know I'm over time, but please bear with me. If I compare the Chinese account to the Hebrew account, 30 years of age, he was 30 years of age. He should show up around about 22 AD, 500 years after Confucius' birth. He shows up at 505 years right after Confucius' birth. He exposed his body to hunger. The Bible account tells us that he fasted for 40 days before he started his mission. He was extreme poverty. The Son of Man, he says, has nowhere to lay his head. That's how poor he is. He's a teacher of 1,000 generations. The Bible calls him the greatest teacher. He forgives sin. Well, that's exactly what he said he did. He saves all men. The Bible text you all are familiar with says, whoever believes. He puts everyone else first. The Bible tells us that he became a servant. He laid down his own life. He died on a cross. And yet, get this, if none of that's fascinating enough, he still lives. He's resurrected in the New Testament. The entire universe surrenders to him. The New Testament says that every knee will bow. He's the King of the universe. He's King of kings and Lord of lords. He stepped down from no position. It says that he left the courts of heaven, became human. He assumed a low position. It says he became a servant. He wins the hearts of everybody. The Bible says, it's already been said once before, it says we love him because he first loved us. Friends, in conclusion, the Chinese people, they were looking for a holy man to show up at the exact same time as Daniel was looking for a holy man to show up. Exactly on time. Either we're dealing with a hoax or we're dealing with something supernatural. I'll leave the decision to you. Thank you.